History as it happens, July 13th, 2021. Emulating Mao.
Doesn't have a democratic with a small d bone in his body, but he's a smart guy. He's one of the guys like Putin who thinks that autocracy is the wave of the future. Democracy can't function in an ever-complex world.
The Chinese Communist Party is celebrating its 100th anniversary by looking to the past and future. Xi Jinping is paying his respects to Mao while sending a warning to the world about where China is going. And Chinese youth, alienated by sharp inequality and the lack of civil liberties, are looking to Mao for revolutionary guidance. The complexities and contradictions of communist China, next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
It's hard to know what they are talking about or what they are thinking behind closed doors. But we can look at a very important metric, which is economic growth, whether the way they are governing the country really would go a long way in terms of growing the economy or continuing to grow the economy and overtake the U.S. My conjecture is that behind closed doors, they are not as confident as they look on the outset.
It's July 1971, and President Richard Nixon has a major announcement to make.
I have requested this television time tonight to announce a major development in our efforts to build a lasting peace in the world. As I have pointed out on a number of occasions over the past 3 years, there can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people. That is why I have undertaken initiatives in several areas to open the door for more normal relations between our two countries.
It is hard to imagine what the world would be like today if China were still isolated and weak. If the U.S. and China were not engaged in something like $550 billion a year in trade. When Nixon visited China the following year in 1972, the two nations barely knew each other. China was recovering from the bloodiest years of Mao's Cultural Revolution. It was a decade of turmoil and murder that followed Mao's Great Leap Forward. That catastrophe ended tens of millions of lives. So it was a truly world-changing moment to see an American president shaking hands with Chairman Mao and walking along the Great Wall.
You would have to conclude that this is a great wall and that it had to be built by a great people. I think one of the results of our trip, we hope, may be that the walls that are erected, whether they are physical walls like this or whether they are other walls of ideology or philosophy, will not divide peoples in the world.
Mao Zedong died in 1976. Deng Xiaoping eventually became supreme leader and ushered in market reforms without which China would not be the world's second largest economy today. So you might be asking why any Chinese leader or citizen today would want to associate with Mao's legacy. Well, it's complicated. At his speech marking the Chinese Communist centenary before 70,000 people in Beijing, President Xi Jinping wore a Mao jacket and paid his respects to the dictator without mentioning any of that bad stuff.
中华大地上全面建成了小康社会，历史性地解决了绝对贫困问题。
Long live the great, glorious, and correct Communist Party of China, Xi proclaimed. He boasted of the party's success lifting people out of poverty, containing the coronavirus, and building a large military, among other accomplishments. China's leaders, like leaders elsewhere, use a selective reading of history to explain where their nation's been and where it's going. But the great irony here is that many Chinese youth are also looking to the past for guidance, but for different reasons. They're embracing Mao, too, by looking to his ideas and writings for some revolutionary guidance in a society they believe is leaving them behind. That is quite a contradiction, as the Chinese Communist Party tells its subjects that it knows what's best for them, and that Western democracy and civil liberties are overrated. So let's dig deeper now with Weifeng Zhong, a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He's doing some remarkable work there, running the open-source Policy Change Index project. It uses machine learning to read and analyze every piece of propaganda produced by the CCP in order to predict China's major policy changes. Weifeng Zhong, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Martin.
So let's begin with an article in The Economist calling China the world's most successful authoritarians, meaning they've lasted longer than much of the world expected, defying Western critics who believe that after the Cold War, communism would soon be extinct. The article says ruthlessness, ideological agility, and economic growth have kept it in power, referring to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, China's economy is market-based, a form of state capitalism, not a communist planned economy any longer. But what do you make of this assessment of the CCP at 100?
I think the term you use, state capitalism, is right on there, because the era of China we are seeing now, after the beginning of the economic reforms in late 1970s, is very different from the China we used to see before that under Mao. Under Mao, China was really a socialist country. Now it's much less so. So I would call it, like you did, state capitalism. And that also points to the success, or some might think of as a surprising development in China, was that many didn't really expect at the point of, for example, China's accession to the WTO, that it would become so successful while remaining an authoritarian regime. So in some sense, you could say that it's really economically successful because it lifted a lot of people out of poverty. The economic growth in China has long been, for years now, very impressive. But the problem also is, of course, the lack of political freedom despite economic growth. And that lack of political freedom is in some way affecting the rest of the Western world as well, because we saw a lot of authoritarian influence by China, not only in the United States, but in a lot of its U.S. allies as well. So that's really the dilemma the world is facing. I think it sums up the challenge for the next century to come is how do we deal with China? That's a big question.
Because China's leaders are arguing we don't need to liberalize our politics. We don't need democracy. We're able to, as you said, lift our population out of poverty without becoming a Western democratic state.
Precisely. I think the dilemma, we always thought that political freedom and economic freedom go hand in hand. Oftentimes, that's also true. So when the world sort of welcomed China into the global economy with open arms, we were expecting that as the economy grew, the Chinese people would also demand more political freedom, which has been true. And then they would also get it. The hard part is that the Chinese people actually, even though many of them wanted political freedom, they did not get it. And I think that's also part of the reason why a lot of young folks now who are not enjoying the same opportunities as the older generation or the wealthier generation, and they are looking back to Mao because the Mao days, things were equal in terms of outcome. So that's what I think attracted a lot of young folks there, relating back to this even more authoritarian, atrocious regime was actually desired these days. It's a very puzzling development and concerning development.
I do want to get into the new affinity for Mao among some Chinese youth, but let's turn to President Xi for the moment. He had his big public speech to mark the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. He was wearing a Mao jacket and standing above a massive portrait of Mao. He said, "China will not be oppressed. We will never allow anyone to bully, oppress, or subjugate China." He castigated those who would lecture China about human rights. It was a defiant, proud speech by someone who clearly believes his nation will soon or should soon be the most powerful. But privately, are China's leaders as confident about their nation's future as they are publicly?
The image of Mao, or this kind of Maoist style, it has both positive and negative effect to the desire of the Chinese regime under President Xi. Because on one hand, he does prefer more power and authority, because that's in some way crucial to China's quest to overtake the United States and becoming a world leader on a global stage. But on the other hand, it's also a slippery slope, because if you really look at Mao, and if you really want to be like Mao, that would be in contradiction to the state capitalism China is doing. You have to stop all these privatizations of state-owned enterprises. In fact, you have to put all the properties and means of productions under public ownership. And so the dilemma facing President Xi Jinping is how much does he really want to imitate the Mao style of governance?
Is Xi building a personality cult around himself?
Perhaps willingly and unwillingly. I think there's a sense in which he desire more personal authorities. And obviously the anti-corruption campaign that he started when he first took office helped achieve that. Because when he first took office, actually many people both inside and outside of China were expecting some form of a reformer. Every time there's a new Chinese president, some observers would hope for a reformist Chinese leader. It has been the case under Deng Xiaoping. It's pretty much the case under Jiang Zemin 2 Chinese presidents ago. But it hasn't been true, obviously, for Xi Jinping. So at first, people were expecting a very reformist style, and then he came in with this hardline anti-corruption campaign that already builds up his personal authorities, even willing or unwillingly, I would say.
I want to go back to an earlier question. I'm not sure we totally answered it. That is, whether China's leaders are as privately confident as they are publicly. They must be aware of, for instance, social discontent around issues of income inequality.
That's a great question. It's hard to know what they are talking about or what they are thinking behind closed doors. But we can look at a very important metric, which is economic growth. Whether the way they are governing the country really would go a long way in terms of growing the economy or continuing to grow the economy and overtake the US. My conjecture is that behind closed doors, they are not as confident as they look on the outset, because there has been for over a decade now what I would call a vicious cycle in the economic development in China, which is that the state capitalism that started in late 1970s created a lot of income inequalities and a lot of social problems. But the Chinese style of governing or policymaking would be to say, let's use the state power or the power of the government to solve those social problems, right? Think of housing prices. Housing is not nearly as affordable as it used to be for a lot of younger folks in China. And so they complained, and some even went out to protest. What the government would do would be to roll out some policies to say, maybe we put restrictions on how high the prices could be, housing prices could be, or maybe we put limit on how many properties one family could buy. That's a policy that they hope would curb those social discontent. But the problem is that once you do that, you are introducing yet another layer of government interventions to the free market, which hurts the economy even more, which then led to more social problems and more inclination to use government intervention to solve those problems. So it started sometime during former President Hu Jintao's term. It gets worse and worse, especially now under President Xi Jinping.
I'm no expert on China. I'm just an observer, but I took Xi's speech to be a tacit acknowledgement that China is, in fact, one of the world's worst human rights abusers. You know, in his warning to the world not to lecture China about what goes on internally. We're talking about the Uyghur Muslims, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the lack of civil liberties inside China. But it does not appear that China's leaders are inclined to change that. They don't see a need to change it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I will also say that many people in China had no idea about the episodes you mentioned, right? At least they have very different views about what's happening in Hong Kong or whether genocide is happening at all in Xinjiang, because the control of propaganda and information in China is so tight and so effective that many people just didn't know about it.
That's an excellent point.
So that's why I think internally Xi Jinping has been and remains very popular, because simply the fact that they just don't know about all these atrocities that we mentioned. Another point I wanted to make was that in China, very often the collective good or the collective goal the Chinese government wants the society to achieve trumps the individualism, right? So sometimes the Chinese government, they would be able to successfully make the argument that we should collectively achieve something despite some undesirable outcomes or problems that we see in the society. So for example, Mao, right? When the Chinese government taught about Mao in schools, where I grew up in Chinese schools, and so I've learned all these. And the judgment they made about Mao or the Mao era was that, he's a state builder. He did many good things, including, China gaining independence and becoming a strong nation. And there are a lot of some bad policies, but he means well. He meant well. And so, of course, the textbook is not going to tell you that under Mao, millions of people died out of the man-made famine. And so they would sort of do some hand-waving in some negative part of history. And then they say, but this is all because we want to achieve the collective good for the society.
So it sounds like, at least to some degree, they acknowledge these past crimes, but they don't dwell on it, or they rationalize it, justify it.
I think they try to paint it as famine that caused, at least in part, by bad weather. So they would downplay the fact that a lot of it is man-made or a policy failure. It's the same as I once traveled to North Korea, and I heard something as a tourist, because when a North Korean guide giving us descriptions of what the North Korean economy is and how it's compared to the South Korean economy, and so they said the North Korean economy is not doing so well as South Korea because we had, less resources, which is not true because they do have more resources. And we have more often we have bad weathers that hurts the agricultural development, which is also not true either. But they just said that as propaganda. And that's exactly the same is happening in China as well.
We're also talking about events that happened a half century or more ago. And even if there were no state censorship or tight control of public education, it's not clear that everyone would see the relevance in these long ago events. Compare it to, say, how Americans view their own history and the treatment of Native Americans. Sure, that was terrible, but that was a couple of centuries ago, and it's not clear why it's even still relevant to a young person's life today. You know what I mean?
I think what you said makes perfect sense. And in my view, I think oftentimes, whether we are talking about the Chinese society or in the United States, oftentimes the fight or the battle for policies, I think it's the same battle for the interpretations of history, or even the language we choose in discussing history. Even though the history is the same thing that people in the past have been through, it's the exact same history. But then the angle we interpret it, or even the words we chose to describe it, differs from person to person, depending on their political persuasion or their views about what the future policy should be. And the same would go for China as well, especially among younger folks in China. Even though there's a tight censorship on the internet, some people who are technologically more capable, they would be able to jump over what we call the firewall, of the great internet firewall of China, and they would be able to have access to information from the outside. And so for those people, they would also learn not only these good things under Mao happen, there are also a lot of bad things that happen under Mao, but they will be subject to their own interpretation, or depending on the arguments they want to make, they might actually overlook the information they could still see from the outside. If a young person in China who did not have the same opportunities as the wealthier economic class, then they would say, because they wanted economic equality or the equality in terms of outcome, they would advocate for Mao policy, despite knowing millions of people had died during the man-made famine. So I think to some extent, in that way, the analogy to the US would be that in the US, we do have free access to information. You can look things up that happened many, many years ago, but the way you interpret it, or the way you overlook certain parts of history in order to make your argument, I think that's a very common problem across different societies.
Or simply being unwilling to acknowledge uncomfortable parts of the past. As I said before, you can tell yourself, sure, it happened, but how is that relevant any longer? Of course, the past is always relevant, right? So China's economy has its problems. Here's an article from the New York Times written by Li Wan. Some 600 million Chinese, or 43% of the population, earn a monthly income of only $150. Many young people believe they can't break into the middle class or out-earn their parents. So China's version of capitalism is producing massive inequality, and young people are alienated.
Yes. And like I said before, a lot of people think that it started under President Xi Jinping. All these social problems, they started in mid-2000s. I run a research project called the Policy Change Index, where we try to parse millions of news articles ever published by China's propaganda machine, the Chinese version of Pravda, if you will, which is called the People's Daily.
That is fascinating.
It is. It's a newspaper that started in 1945. And so imagine how many words that have ever been uttered by the Chinese Communist Party, right? But what we do in the project is to say, let's go back to all these words, look at what exactly the Chinese government has said. And are we able to trace any signs of upcoming policy changes just because they said certain words. And that makes a lot of sense oftentimes in the communist regime, because oftentimes when you position the Communist Party as somebody who's smart and all the rest of the population is just stupid, and so you come in to help, you provide guidance to lead us to a better society, then oftentimes before you push out certain policies, you have to change people's minds first. You have to manipulate their ideology in preparation for the policies you want to implement. And what we have seen by this methodology, what we have seen around mid-2000s, was that the Chinese government started to push out narratives about all these social problems before they actually slow down economic reforms. Because 15 years of economic reforms in China has brought a lot of income inequalities around 2003, 2004. That's when former President Hu Jintao came in, and his slogan was harmonious society. He wanted the Chinese society to go to a more harmonious place because it's not harmonious right now when he was starting in 2003. And so the first step they took is to say all these social problems, they call for government solution. And then they started to go in and say, let's intervene the market because market hasn't worked so well. So let's start intervening the markets, control housing prices, and use state-owned enterprises as part of the solution to solve social problems. But then when you do that, you are deviating from the free market reforms that China started in the 1970s.
That statistic I cited was from an article about how young people are embracing Mao again, rediscovering his writings and looking to him for some guidance. They probably don't want the chaos of the Mao years. So why are young people in China returning to Mao, so to speak? We touched on it a little bit before, but let's return to it now.
I think the fundamental reason was that a lot of those people, especially the younger generation who are deprived of equal opportunities, they want equal opportunities. But the point of attack they are now initiating is to get equality of outcome. Right now, they are not able to afford expensive housing because they have lacked the economic opportunities. But what they want to achieve now is to say, we want equal outcome. We want to be able to buy those expensive apartments. And that prompted the government sometimes to initiate market interventions to lower the housing prices. And I think that's the problem here, because I think, and that's the same for a lot of societies too. Ultimately, what we want is equal opportunities. And that's the fundamental principle for human flourishment. But oftentimes, when we are discontent, we resort to equality of outcome. If you want to achieve economic outcome, look at communism. Maybe that's a very equal outcome in terms of what the policy could achieve, except for those who are in charge of communism, they are extremely wealthy, relatively speaking. But the rest of the population was very equal. Do we want to get to that stage? I don't think so. This is slippery slope thinking, now very common in many populist societies, is that how far do you want to go with this agenda? Please lay out the ultimate goalpost before we talk about policies. What's the ideal that you have, or what's your vision for the country? And is the policy we are implementing today helpful in achieving that vision? Even if you talk with a younger Chinese person who are deprived of opportunities, if you explain this to him or her, he or she would realize that the communism that used to happen in the 60s and 70s is not where we want to go.
And the irony here is that China's leaders aren't so happy about young people looking to Mao and finding his revolutionary zeal so appealing. They don't want revolution.
In some sense, that's what I meant by saying the Maoism, or the resurgence of this ideology, it has both positive and negative effect on the prospect of Xi Jinping's presidency. But the upside is, of course, he gets more authority. But the downside is that the slippery slope logic would lead to something in terms of the ultimate vision of the country that President Xi Jinping may not want to go.
So we've been talking about China's domestic issues. Let's turn to foreign policy now. It does not appear to me that China is interested in exporting its brand of socialism, or that it wants to exercise military hegemony over the rest of the globe, with the exception of the South China Sea, of course. What's your take on that?
I think I would even partially contend on that point, because I think China does have the ambition to overtake the U.S. as the leading global power. And achieving regional hegemony is only the first step of achieving global hegemony. And we have seen that for years now from the project I developed, the Policy Change Index, tracking all these narratives, because the talking point about the necessity for China to be a leader on a global stage started again in mid-2000s. So, and in fact, not long after China joined the WTO, a lot of policies that we nowadays see as undesirable, they was taking off very soon after China acceded to the World Trade Organization, including, for example, China used to have a theft of intellectual property, but it wasn't like a key part of the industrial policy. But after China joined the WTO, it became part of the industrial policy because the way the Chinese government saw for the country to advance in science and technology was to catch up with the West. And so it has been going this way, that some of the bad practices in the past were perhaps just the byproduct of a imperfect market reforms. They became the key themes of Chinese policies. And starting from there, I think China gradually formed a vision of overtaking the Western liberal international order. I would go actually further and said, I don't think that their ambition is only regionally in the South China Sea, but it's a first step toward achieving what they consider as the higher goal there.
Well, there are many ways for a nation to extend its influence. Military is one way. The United States has been trying that for the past 30 years since the end of the Cold War, and the results have been disastrous. Do China's leaders want to give that a try too and build bases everywhere, nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers? Because they must see the costs, the potential costs of trying to maintain such a global empire.
Yeah, I am not a military expert, so I can't speak too much on, for example, the possible cost of maintaining the hegemony. But qualitatively, we do know that it's very costly for the US to maintain global hegemony. But what we do know is it's possible for China to achieve, at least get close to the US leadership on the global stage. Because if we look at history, we don't really have an example of a state capitalist country like China being so powerful and being able to challenge the US. We had Soviet Union, but that's not a capitalist system. So China is at least a partially capitalist system. And China has been very successful in terms of using government power or government policy to advance certain industries. The reason, for example, now we are talking about legislation with regard to the US Innovation and Competition Act this year that just passed the Senate. The reason in the US we are now talking about AI, robotics, and all these advanced technologies is because of the threat from China, because China has been able to quickly catch up with the US. If we talk about AI, for example, right? Part of the reason China was able to so quickly catch up with the US was because a lot of Chinese researchers, they are able to read English language articles, academic articles or research or programming developments in the space of the internet in the US. And they are much more capable to do that than, for example, a US researcher reading Chinese publication about AI in China, right? So this kind of language asymmetry is to China's advantage. So China was able to, not only because China has a lot of resources, but China also has this mentality among a lot of researchers to learn from the US. I grew up in a system of the education where the main theme of the day-to-day teaching was we learn from the best in the world. We have textbooks. When I was in college, the textbooks were all from the US, some copies that has infringed on the copyright. And basically, they just distribute, photocopy the US textbooks to college students. Of course, they didn't pay the appropriate price to acquire those textbooks. But that's what was taught in college. We use Western textbooks. We learn the Western technologies. The whole theme of education is to imitate and to catch up with the West. And China has been very successful in doing that.
I'd like to get your closing thoughts on the following. So much of the news coverage of the U.S.-China relationship is framed as confrontational, a potential clash of arms even over an issue like Taiwan. Isn't there room for real diplomacy and cooperation here on any number of issues, while also acknowledging there will be times when the United States and China are at odds?
Absolutely. And I think that's the fact that you raise this question points a lot of problems with our discourse, political discourse in not only this country and also in China as well. is that oftentimes on a lot of issues, it's not really just either left or right. When it comes to US and China relations, I think what US has tried now for over 2 decades have been two extremes. One is what I would call the romantic engagement, starting from China's accession to the WTO to before former President Trump took office. So everything that happened from 2000 to about 2016 was that we just go in to make money because, money is good, the market is good in China. So we go in and we make money because it's so beautiful. And it improves so many people's lives. That does achieve certain goals of economic flourishment. But the other extreme was after former President Trump took office, is we tried this decoupling or divorce, if you will, opposite to romantic engagement. Because if you play up the national security threat from China, you might get into the mindset of perhaps decoupling from trade altogether with China. Would that be a good idea? I don't think so, because we have had tariffs on Chinese goods for several years now. Has the policy changed any Chinese behavior? No. Has it hurt US consumers and companies? Every single day, right? And so I think the right way to look at US-China policy is that I think the goal we want to achieve here is to continue to have the trade with China, but in a way that's safe from our perspective, from the perspective of defending national security, from the perspective of preventing any authoritarian influence in our economy, in our society, which is, I think, urgently needed. Even, for example, if you look at the higher education system in the US, right? China, for years now, has been trying to influence academics in the US by giving money to universities and giving money to university professors. So is money from China a good thing or bad thing? It depends, right? I don't think we should have any policy that says universities should not take any Chinese money or money from China, because that in itself is a prevention of a lot of academic exchange between US and China scholars, right? But do we say universities can continue to accept money from China without concerning about any national security implications? I don't think that's true. As we have seen just a couple of years ago, the chair of the chemistry department at Harvard University was arrested because he was recruited by Chinese scholarship programs with the Chinese government in order to steal IP in the US. A lot of American professors who are under the so-called 1,000 talent program by the Chinese government was partly to steal intellectual property in the US. So that would be a problem. And so how the US could engage economically with China in a way that's safe to our national security, I think that's a hard problem to tackle. And I don't think any answer, extreme left or extreme right, will be the right way to go.
So this is going to be my final question, or maybe my final thoughts, and I'll get your reaction. History has a way of changing quickly when you least expect it. So right now, today, the Chinese Communist Party appears entrenched in power, and the leaders appear to be right about what they're saying about Chinese socialism and pulling people out of poverty, taking credit for the country's accomplishments, and minimizing their responsibility for the country's problems. But who's to say there won't be some massive unforeseen change before the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, which I guess would be 2049?
I think that's a good question. How far this trajectory of state capitalism can China go? And I don't think we have all the evidence to say either way. Obviously, like many others, I see many problems facing the Chinese economy, including even the population, because under decades of one-child policy, China is going to face a lot of challenges, including in the social security system, because there are now just so fewer younger population than the older one. Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, I was born the first year that the one-child policy was first implemented in where I was born. Now I'm approaching the middle age, and the same goes with, for example, all the generations that's as old as my parents, for example. They are in retirement age. And now we have just half of the population at my generation as opposed to their generation, for example. So the burden on Social Security is a very serious concern. And there are many other challenges facing China too. But I do see the advantage China was able to pull together the artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies that I mentioned. And so I think the jury is still out in terms of how far China can go. But I don't agree with those who said the Chinese economy is going to collapse simply because it's not democratic. I don't think that vision is holding water anymore, because we have seen how impressive the Chinese economy can be while remaining an authoritarian regime. And so I guess we have to wait and see and talk again in 2049.
Well, if my podcast makes it to 2049, Weifeng Zhong of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, you'll be my first guest on the next episode of History as It Happens. I hope you enjoyed your 4th of July holiday. So why is it when we think of the Revolutionary War, we tend not to think of, well, war? The American War for Independence was like any war, before or since. Violent, nasty, bloody. So why is that often left out of our common memory? That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.